In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act request unlocked a filing cabinet that the United States Army had kept sealed for 27 years. Inside were over 1,000 pages of testimony, memoranda, and operational reports that told a story the American public was never supposed to hear. Documents that detailed how the Army had sprayed bacterial agents over San Francisco, releasing clouds of microorganisms into subway systems across New York City, and conducted what they called field testing in populated areas from Minneapolis to St. Louis. And this is not speculation. This is what the declassified documents say. The official record shows that between 1949 and 1969, the United States Army conducted biological agent testing in at least 239 populated areas across America. They sprayed bacteria from ships positioned off the California coast. They dropped light bulbs filled with microorganisms from subway gratings in Manhattan. They released chemical particles from trucks driving through residential neighborhoods. All without the knowledge or consent of the people living there. Some of these tests exposed over 1 million Americans to potentially harmful agents, and according to the documents, at least one person died as a direct result. To understand how the United States Army came to spray bacteria over American cities, you have to go back to 1949. Harry Truman was president. The Berlin airlift had just ended. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb just weeks earlier, shattering America's nuclear monopoly. The world had changed overnight, and nobody knew what came next. This was a different America than the one we know today. There was no CNN, no internet, no 24-hour news cycle questioning every government decision. When officials said something was classified for national security, that was the end of the conversation. The press trusted the government. The public trusted the government, and the government was terrified of the Soviet Union. In 1950, President Truman signed National Security Council Directive NSC 68, a classified document that called for a massive military buildup against Soviet threats. The directive was explicit. America needed to develop capabilities in biological and chemical warfare, both offensive and defensive. It was not enough to have atomic weapons. The Soviets might have those too. America needed every possible advantage in what everyone assumed would be the next World War. The document, declassified 25 years later, showed how the highest levels of government created an atmosphere where national security could justify almost any action. Scientists were recruited from the nation's top universities. Budgets were unlimited. Questions were discouraged. Fort Detrick in Maryland became the center of America's biological weapons program, employing over 5,000 personnel at its peak. Most of them had no idea what their colleagues in other buildings were working on. Compartmentalization was everything. The world was divided into those who needed to know and those who did not. And the American people definitely did not need to know. The moment everything changed can be traced to a single piece of paper. On September 15, 1950, Major General William M. Creasy, Chief of the Army Chemical Corps, signed a memorandum that would alter the lives of millions of Americans. The memo, discovered in declassified files 27 years later, authorized what Creasy called field testing of biological agents in populated areas. The stated purpose was to determine the offensive potential of biological agents and to develop defensive measures. But what that clinical language actually meant was human experimentation on a massive scale. Creasy would later testify to Congress that he believed these tests were essential to national defense. The Soviet Union, he argued, certainly possessed similar capabilities. America could not afford to be caught unprepared. The general was a World War II veteran who had seen chemical weapons used on European battlefields. He understood warfare in ways that civilians could not. This was not theory to him. This was survival. The memorandum established the framework that would govern biological testing for the next 2 decades. Tests would be conducted in secret. Results would be classified. Local authorities would not be informed. The agents used would be selected based on their ability to simulate actual biological weapons while being allegedly harmless to human health. The word allegedly would prove to be crucial. The Army scientists needed test subjects, and they had found them. 800,000 people in San Francisco. 1 million commuters in New York City, entire neighborhoods in Minneapolis and St. Louis, all of them unwitting participants in the largest biological weapons testing program in American history. According to the documents, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had officially authorized biological weapons research with a budget that would reach $90 million by 1969. That is over $700 million in today's money. But that was only the beginning. 5 days after General Creasy signed his authorization, the USS Terrell, a military minesweeper, took position 2 miles off the coast of San Francisco. It was September 20th, 1950. The crew had been told they were conducting a routine naval exercise. They had no idea they were about to become part of the first large-scale biological weapons test on an American city. The Army had chosen San Francisco specifically because of its fog patterns and topography. The city sits on a peninsula surrounded by water, creating natural wind tunnels that would help disperse whatever was released into the air. Weather conditions had been monitored for 3 days. Everything had to be perfect. As fog rolled in from the Pacific Ocean, deck-mounted spray nozzles on the Terrell began releasing clouds of Serratia marcescens bacteria into the moist air. Army scientists had classified Serratia as a harmless simulant for biological weapons testing, despite the fact that medical literature from the 1940s already documented cases of the bacteria causing serious infections in immunocompromised patients. But the classification became the cornerstone justification for what happened next. For 2 days, the bacterial cloud drifted over San Francisco Bay and into the city itself, covering 117 square miles and exposing approximately 800,000 residents. The bacteria was chosen because it was easy to detect and count in environmental samples. Army personnel stationed throughout the city collected air samples and monitored the dispersion patterns. They documented wind speeds, humidity levels, and temperature variations. They created detailed maps showing exactly where the bacteria had traveled and in what concentrations. What they did not do was tell anyone what was happening. Not the mayor, not the health department, not the hospitals that would soon start seeing unusual illness patterns. The test was considered a complete success. The Army now knew that a biological agent released from a ship offshore could blanket an entire major city. They also knew that nobody had noticed. Nobody had questioned the unusual fog or the strange smell that some residents reported. According to internal Army documents, this proved that biological weapons could be deployed against American cities without detection. The implications for warfare were obvious, but the implications for American citizens were about to become deadly serious. 10 days after the Army sprayed bacteria over San Francisco, Edward Nevin was admitted to Stanford Hospital. He was 75 years old, a retired pipe fitter who had lived in the Bay Area his entire adult life. Nevin was recovering from prostate surgery when he developed what his doctors initially thought was a routine post-operative infection. But this was not routine. The infection spread rapidly through his bloodstream, attacking his heart valves and overwhelming his immune system. His doctors had never seen anything like it. They tried every antibiotic available, but nothing worked. The bacteria was resistant to all standard treatments. On October 31st, 1950, Edward Nevin died. His death certificate listed endocarditis due to an organism of the Serratia family as the cause of death. His family was told it was a medical mystery, one of those tragic cases that sometimes happen after surgery. They had no way of knowing that 10 days earlier, the United States Army had released billions of Serratia marcescens bacteria into the air over their city. But Nevin was not the only case. Stanford University Hospital recorded an unusual cluster of 11 Serratia marcescens infections between September and November 1950. That represented a dramatic increase from the hospital's normal rate of 1 such infection per year. Before 1950, Serratia infections were extremely rare. Hospital records show that most doctors had never seen a case. Suddenly, in the months immediately following the Army's bacterial release, Stanford was treating nearly 1 case per week. Hospital staff noted the cluster but attributed it to improved diagnostic techniques rather than environmental exposure. This pattern would be replicated in other test cities across the country. Unusual illness clusters appearing in the weeks and months after Army testing explained away as statistical anomalies or improved medical detection. The Army conducted its own internal investigation into the San Francisco illnesses, led by Dr. Riley Housewright of Fort Detrick. The investigation report, classified as secret and not declassified until 1977, concluded that the bacterial release was not responsible for the infections. The report recommended continuing the testing program without modifications. Army scientists were aware of the potential connection between their tests and the illness cluster. They chose to prioritize the testing program over public health concerns. The report was filed away without informing medical authorities or the families of those who had died. The success of the San Francisco test opened the floodgates. Over the next 2 decades, the Army would conduct biological or chemical agent testing in at least 239 populated areas across the United States. The scale was unprecedented in American history. Each test was carefully planned with meteorological studies, population density analysis, and post-release monitoring. The program involved multiple military branches and civilian contractors, creating a vast network of secret operations with a total budget exceeding $300 million in period currency. New York City became a particular focus. Between 1966 and 1968, Army researchers conducted at least 239 documented biological agent releases in the subway system. They worked with the New York Transit Authority but never informed city health officials or the public about the experiments. The tests used Bacillus subtilis variant Niger, chosen because its dark spores made it easier to track dispersion patterns through the underground tunnels. Army operatives would drop light bulbs filled with bacteria from subway gratings during rush hour, simulating a biological attack on the transit system. Over 1 million commuters were exposed during the course of these experiments. In Minneapolis, from 1953 to 1954, the Army conducted what they called smokescreen tests that actually involved releasing zinc-cadmium sulfide particles from trucks and aircraft. Residents were exposed to potentially toxic heavy metals without their knowledge or consent. Minneapolis was chosen as a control city because its demographics and geography were considered representative of potential Soviet targets. Similar tests were conducted in Chicago, Kansas City, and Washington, D.C. The pattern was always the same: a plausible cover story, careful meteorological planning, no notification to local authorities, and detailed monitoring to measure the effectiveness of the dispersal. All biological testing programs were classified under multiple levels of secrecy. Planning documents were marked top secret. Operational records were classified as secret. Access was limited to personnel with Q clearances and a strict need-to-know basis that excluded medical professionals and city officials. This classification system ensured that even when suspicious illness patterns emerged, local doctors and health officials had no way to connect them to government testing. The compartmentalization was so effective that many Army personnel involved in logistics never knew what they were actually spraying. They were told it was harmless smoke for weather research or radar calibration studies. Follow the evidence, not the narrative. The evidence. The wall of secrecy began to crack in 1974, but not because of the biological testing program. Investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published exposés in the New York Times, revealing CIA domestic surveillance programs. His reporting created the political momentum for congressional oversight of intelligence agencies that had operated without meaningful scrutiny since World War II. Hersh's work did not initially focus on biological testing, but it opened the door for other journalists and researchers to dig deeper into classified programs using newly available Freedom of Information Act tools. Political scientist Leonard Cole spent 5 years researching biological testing programs, filing dozens of FOIA requests that uncovered thousands of previously classified documents. His academic credentials and persistence were crucial to legitimizing the story and moving it from conspiracy theory to documented history. But the government was not passive during this process. In 1972, following growing concerns about government surveillance programs, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MK-Ultra records. The Army simultaneously destroyed an estimated 80% of its biological testing documentation, including detailed health monitoring data from test cities. Army officials later testified that the destruction was routine record disposal, but the timing suggests it was deliberate obstruction of potential oversight. What the government could not destroy, however, were the memories of people who had participated in the programs. In September 1977, the Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research, chaired by Senator Edward Kennedy, held public hearings on biological testing. For the first time, Army officials acknowledged the San Francisco tests under oath. Colonel Charles P. May testified about the program and admitted there were possible adverse health effects. The hearings were carried live on television and created a national scandal. Americans learned that their own government had used them as unwitting test subjects in biological weapons experiments. The testimony revealed that the Army had conducted tests not just in San Francisco, but in cities across the country. Millions of Americans had been exposed to potentially harmful agents without their knowledge or consent. And this is not speculation. This is what the declassified documents say. The documents are clear on this point. Despite congressional investigations revealing clear evidence of human experimentation without consent, no criminal charges were ever filed against any government officials involved in biological testing programs. The Department of Justice concluded in 1979 that prosecution was not warranted, citing national security considerations and the difficulty of proving criminal intent decades after the fact. This decision established a precedent that government officials conducting classified programs would face no personal legal consequences. In 1981, Edward Nevin's family filed a federal lawsuit against the government seeking $11 million in damages. The case was dismissed in 1987 when a federal judge ruled that the government was immune from liability for discretionary acts performed in the interest of national security. The ruling effectively meant that any government action conducted under national security authority would be immune from civil lawsuits, regardless of harm caused to citizens. The 1975 Church Committee investigations did lead to the creation of permanent Congressional Intelligence Oversight Committees and Executive Order 12333 in 1981, which prohibited intelligence agencies from conducting experiments on human subjects without informed consent. These reforms effectively ended domestic biological testing programs, but they were designed for future prevention rather than accountability for past actions, leaving victims without recourse. And this is the pattern I keep seeing in these declassified files. The same institutional forces that enable government secrecy in the name of national security also enable government abuse under that same justification. The classification system that was designed to protect legitimate secrets also protects illegitimate ones. As of 2024, an estimated 2,000 documents related to biological testing programs remain classified. The Department of Defense cites ongoing national security concerns and sources and methods protections to justify continued secrecy more than 70 years after the programs ended. FOIA requests are routinely denied, and appeals can take years to process, suggesting institutional resistance to full disclosure remains strong. There is a growing community of people who believe these stories deserve to be told. If you are one of them, subscribe and join us. Because history has a way of surfacing the truth. It just takes time. This video presents information from publicly available documents and reports. Some details remain contested or unconfirmed.